Welcome everyone to CG's webinar number somewhere in the 390s. I think we are. We should find out what number we are before we hit the 400 mark because we're very close to it. And our topic today with Vedika Kedia, whom you will meet in a moment, is social science research in India, navigating the borders of global and local terrain. But before I bring our presenter to your attention, I'm struggling with a new computer here, so Chris, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do this quickly. I'll hang on, wait a minute. Well, maybe we're there.
I can do one meeting.
Can you see my screen?
There's nothing shown on your screen.
It's always a worry when that happens. Yeah, look, let me try once more. Yeah, it's not coming through. Okay, no, I'm going to have to adjust the settings. Well, let me tell you what the webinar protocols are. Sorry, Vedika, to interrupt the thing. That's Vedika's opening slide, but the next slide I think you'll find is the first housekeeping slide. Yes. Now, please note that the webinar is being recorded, so you can find it again, and including your own contribution in the Q&A on YouTube through our website and directly into our YouTube channel. And you just go to YouTube and type in CG webinar, and you'll get 300 webinars, and hopefully this one will be at the top. Now, during the webinar, please keep your computer sound off and turn it on, of course, when you come into the Q&A discussion after Vedika's done her presentation about halfway through. But until then, do turn it off because extraneous noise can intervene and can affect the speaker. Now, we advise you to use speaker view in the top right-hand corner there because you can see who's speaking at any given time during the webinar. Now, to join the discussion, and the discussion is an important part of the webinar, as I said, starts about halfway through. You post your question for the speaker or your statement about the speaker's presentation in the chat. And from what's coming through in the chat, I'll be able to compose the Q&A speaking list. I'll give you a warning when I'm about to bring you in to the Q&A. I'll send you a little note in the chat, but you really do need to signal that desire to speak in the chat first. Come in early because if you come in towards the end of the webinar, the speaking list can often be full by then and you miss out. And when you're about to come in, as I said, I'll send you a note. You then turn on your mic, very important to do that. Turn on your camera if you can, and then tell us who you are, where you are from, and then come out with your question or your statement. Thanks, Chris. I think we can take it off screen now. Vedika Kedia is graduate from the Lady Shri Ram College for Women, New Delhi, recipient of the Premier Indian Institute's coveted Best Student Prize. And she's been in her educational journey at the National University of Singapore and Sciences Po in Paris. She also pursued a master's in China Studies as a Yenching Academy scholar at Peking University in Beijing. So that's pretty impressive, Vedika. You've been in Singapore, in Paris, in France, and in China for substantial periods of time. You also have just completed an MSc in education at Oxford. So that's a fourth milestone. Your master's dissertation was on social science research in India between the global and the local. And I think we're all really interested to see what's going to come from you in this presentation. I'm really happy to hand over the screen to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon, for the lovely introduction. Just start with the presentation. So, hello everyone, welcome to my webinar. In this presentation, I attempt to outline my research findings that from the research that I've undertaken for my MSc dissertation under the supervision of Professor Simon Marchinson and Dr. Shinshu, and also my associated publication that I'm currently working on with Professor Alice Andrea and Dr. Shane on the social science research in India. In this presentation, I will explore the social science research in India in the context of the global research environment. And this study is also a self-reflective study of my own journey as a scholar navigating through varied higher education landscapes. And the image from this presentation is also drawn from my own journey. So beginning this presentation, at the outset, I recognize two different aspects of the global research environment. First is the dynamics of knowledge production. In social sciences, for instance, the canonical literature was organized at the time of colonial expansion around the theme of the colonial difference, while Cornell, for instance, explores the temporal dimension of colonial difference in a form of linear progression from the primitive societies of the colonies to the modernized colonial powers, for instance, but Vignolo explores the spatial dimension of what is considered to be as the colonial difference, where the Occident were the ones that created the disciplinary knowledge, which was considered to be universal and was projected on the Orient as universal theories. And this Occident-Orient divide was further mapped into the geographies, which construed the disciplinary knowledge, while the knowledge emerging from the so-called Orient was considered to be particular knowledge or area studies, which was just relegated to understanding of these particular geographies. In addition to the dynamics of knowledge production, there is also asymmetries that exist within the global science, which is a structure that circulates, recognizes, and legitimates knowledge in status quo. So, for instance, the global citation indexes, where 70% of the journals in social science are actually emerged from 4 publishing houses based in the global north. In the study, the global north is drawn from de Sousa Santos's definition, in which it is meant to represent the communities that have historically been involved in the construction of the so-called global design within varied disciplines, for instance, the majority Anglo-European groups. So in addition to this, the global citation indexes also exclude a number of journals which are based within which are limited to the local geographies of the global south and are also kind of published in non-uniform frequency of intervals. In addition, the open access publications, for example, where universities in the global north often purchase publishing rights for these publications, which are widely accessible by scholars across the globe, while scholars in the global south often have to allocate funding from the research process itself to pay the high article processing charges that are required for these journals so as to be globally visible for their research. Thus, scholars then, due to this inequality, tend to rely on the global recognition systems of the global north and thus align with the Eurocentric theories and methodologies that were construed due to the dynamics of knowledge production. In this slide, I just aim to outline a brief context of the social science research in India. A former colony, India gained independence from the British in 1947. And before independence, the universities that were formulated were modeled after the collegiate system of the University of London. The main aim of these universities was to create a generation of Indian youth that could be eligible to fill the middle ranks of the Indian administrative services, and thus research was not a prerogative of these particular institutes. After independence, the focus of social science research was on addressing the chronic economic issues like poverty and unemployment within the nation state, and therefore disciplines that directly address these issues like economics were given greater salience. Thereafter, with the establishment of Indian Council for Social Science Research in 1969, Salience was initially accorded to different disciplines within the social science research field, like political science and sociology. Jumping to 1990s, which saw an expansion of the higher education system in India, there was an increased enrollment within undergraduate programs in universities across India. However, there was still a reduced proportional enrollment to higher degree programs, such as the PhD programs within universities, and therefore the few central universities continue to remain the centers for social science research in India. In the right, the image basically shows the distribution of research output in top 12 countries. And here we can see that the proportion of social science research in India is quite minimal compared to the research that takes place within the fields of technology and other physical sciences. And a point to be noted is that while the proportion will also be equal for countries like China and Japan, a number of research publications within these countries are also stored in non-English languages like Chinese, for instance, and therefore the picture of global citation indexes does not adequately cover the social science research that takes place in these countries as opposed to in India, where 80% of social science research is still conducted within the English language. Within this backdrop, my research aims to understand that how do social science researchers in India, in the specific discipline of international relations, navigate the research environment, including the global research system. Secondly, how do they perceive the value of the social science research in the system, given that higher value in the system is often accorded to disciplines that often bring about or are directly linked with innovation in the economy. The research designed for the study was drawn from social constructivism, which basically argues that individuals experience reality through their interactions, and therefore the knowledge of this reality can be constructed by understanding these interactions. Also drawing from the reflexive standpoint, the study assumed that all knowledges are inherently subjective, and therefore the researcher's subjectivity thus becomes an asset in the process of knowledge generation. The study chose international relations as a discipline because there's an intrinsic international element towards the discipline, which meant that scholars, meaning that it provided a potential avenue to understand scholars' interactions with the global domain. But also my own familiarity with the discipline, like since I've already done my master's in international relations and area studies, I felt that my experience would help me capture the in-depth dynamics that exist within this discipline. The participants were chosen from different universities based in Delhi, and the reason for the choice of the National Capital Region as the location was due to the historical prominence of IR in the capital. And this is because the former institutes of international relations education were founded in Delhi, but also thereafter scholars believed that greater proximity to the political milieu in the country offered them greater opportunities for conducting research and networking, and therefore there was a greater emergence of think tanks and other research centers within the capital. For the methods, I conducted 16 in-depth qualitative interviews, which lasted for about 60 to 90 minutes each. Since there is relatively lesser literature on social science research, the interviews were semi-structured and open-ended questions to allow participants the space to kind of answer questions that have not been asked, but also to explore different complexities that exist within the research landscape. This is just to highlight how I attempted to establish equity amongst the participants with regard to gender, institutional affiliation, and research experience. Going to the findings of the study, the scholars in the study, my participants have from now on referred to as scholars with different alphabetical pseudonyms. The scholars basically argue that there is a Western orientation that is prevalent within the field, which has implications for the theories and the methodological toolkit that is present within the discipline that helps them to capture the realities in their research. For instance, the scholar P highlights how, like, normally the study of IR begins with the Peloponnesian War and then goes on to discuss the 30 Years' War with the ideas of urbanization and industrialization. And therefore, the theories that have been formed have been inspired by these Western historical, political, and sociological realities. But also that while these theories are inherently drawn from Western experiences, the methods within the field also tend to rely on these existing theories. And therefore, and most of the research in the field is also engaged with testing the existing theories in connection to a particular case study. And therefore, the scholars within the study also experience a kind of disconnect between the realities that they aim to capture and the theoretical and methodological tools that they had in place. For instance, Scholar G pointed out that there's something to Indian IR which is beyond what the West has theorized and conceptualized and says is the practice. And so while the scholars were engaging with the field, in which the conceptual and methodological toolkit had to be molded to be able to capture the realities, they were also facing a challenging home terrain in which not only was financial precarity a regular issue, but also with the onset of think tanks, which were much more oriented towards policy-centric research. A lot of the limited funding opportunities were often diverted to these think tanks, and therefore it further constrained the space for academia. But also within that, there was also infrastructural deficits, like for instance, deficits within library infrastructures that made the job much more difficult for them. But this line of bureaucracy also suggests that while there were limited opportunities, even access to these limited opportunities were often challenging due to the bureaucratic nature of these institutions. Like, for instance, one scholar pointed out as to how even after receiving a particular grant for her research, she only received half the amount of the grant, whereas the other half never came. And so this made the environment even more challenging for these researchers. But navigating in this particular section, I try to outline how do they navigate the challenging environment. So first, I think while scholars experience the disconnect between the lived realities and the methodological and theoretical inclinations of the field, they try to incorporate more primary evidence to be able to counter the existing Western conceptualizations that exist. As scholar O pointed out, the need for empirical work is greater as there is more to prove. But also they felt that by incorporating greater field work within the research, there was a greater knowledge that was being disseminated, because they could now incorporate a number of local perspectives and thus bridge the gap between the subject and object. As scholar K points out, when you're visiting the field, you're being one of them and you tend to know a lot. And while they were trying to incorporate greater elements of fieldwork within the research, they also faced challenges of bureaucracy and access for funding for the fieldwork, for instance, but also conducting fieldwork outside India, which they felt was challenging. As one participant pointed out, that he would never receive replies for requests to undertake research within international organizations, for instance. And then after trying to incorporate the research, I think a lot of scholars also try to navigate the system by drawing from the existing theories. Scholars who are working within the existing theories try to incorporate different ways to mold the theories to be able to capture the realities. Like, for instance, scholars pointed out that theories like realism, liberalism were much more incorporated in understanding the perspectives of the superpowers, or trying to characterize the experiences of the rogue states. But there was little literature that kind of engaged with the middle powers, which constituted the majority of the world. And therefore, the scholars working with these existing theories felt that they would be contributing a middle power perspectives towards existing knowledge. But secondly, a number of scholars found greater resonance within the critical school of IR, because a lot of them felt that the school or outside the mainstream canon basically drew from other disciplines which have greater history of recording post-colonial experiences. As Scholar D points out, while the IR we knew of today was foreign, women's studies of feminism was strongly rooted in Indian theories, and therefore they found greater flexibility in being able to capture the realities, the lived experiences in India with the use of these critical IR theories. But there was a third group of scholars that actually also engaged in building alternative conceptualizations drawn from non-Western knowledge sources to create different conceptual tools that could be much more flexible and and that could help them capture the realities. Like for instance, Scholar P points out, it's like fusion music, where you are drawing from non-Western knowledge sources to kind of explain different realities in different parts of the world without further creating binaries of Western and non-Western. While they attempt to navigate this space, the researchers often face challenges in participating in this global conversation and contributing to the disciplinary knowledge of the field. Scholars felt that there was a global bias in the way their work was received within the global space, and that their work was mainly relegated to Indian IR or understanding of India, but not really incorporated into the disciplinary terrain of knowledge. As scholar N points out, people in the South know that they are doing area studies, but those in the Western world don't. Uh, Highlighting the fact that all knowledges are inherently situated, but there were certain knowledges that were considered to have more universal implications. Secondly, also while their own research was relegated to understanding of the particular, scholars also felt that they had limited authority or perceived to have limited authority in understanding American or European issues. And therefore, as scholar L points out, while scholars globally would be keen on looking at work coming on India, however, Indians thinking about American issues would not draw so much of traction, and therefore there was limited epistemic privilege which was accorded to these scholars to be able to understand these realities. But secondly, in the conversation, in participating in this global conversation, they felt that there was an influence of the global connection, means that there were a certain templates which were expected of the researchers. As scholar C states, being in India and working on Indian international relations, one often gets cast into this role of sort of being the India explainer to outside. This basically states that while Indian IR experts are expected to provide an analysis of Indian foreign policy. For example, what is India's position with regard to China? There was little interest in drawing from theoretical endeavors by Indian scholars. And so while these were the challenges they faced in contributing towards the disciplinary knowledge in the field, there were also challenges that they faced in having greater participation within the global conversation. As scholars pointed that the access to global publications was limited due to the resource crunch and limited library infrastructure, but also the archive syllabuses in universities in India meant that students and professors were less likely to be exposed to, say, cutting-edge research that is emerging from different parts of the world. Their participation in academic conferences was also limited as due to a number of issues, including the visa processes, which meant that they could often not participate in academic conferences which were taking place in the global north. While some scholars did benefit from having international collaborations, they felt that that's people with certain privileges and having access to prior international study experience could be much more fluid within these international networks and could benefit more from these collaborations. In navigating through the challenges of participating in the global conversation, a number of scholars felt that there was a merit in delinking from this global conversation to focus on topics that they thought were of personal or contextual relevance. And in this process, they would forego the mainstream recognition and dealing from these global imaginaries that constitute with knowledge emerging from certain geographies as universal. And therefore, Scholar P highlighted that part of the endeavor should be not be a part of this club, meaning that the concerns of this particular club becomes your concern. And therefore, in this process of delinking from this global conversation, the scholars felt a greater agency in trying to pursue topics. But of course, this came with greater challenges in which a lot of them had to forego a great professional cost, meaning at the cost of meaning some scholars felt that they would not be globally visible and therefore be foregoing certain career goals to be able to be recognized, to be able to pursue research of their choices. This slide basically highlights as to how sometimes the participants also draw on their personal experiences to which provides them with the impetus to go beyond the conventional theories. As certain scholars felt that their close experiences with conflicts, for instance, meant that they grew up listening to stories of these particular experiences, and therefore they felt that a number of times these Western theoretical tools were not able to actively capture the realities that they themselves or their close ones had experienced. Drawing on the idea of border thinking, which was highlighted by Mignolo, the border thinking basically posits a form of uh, of decoloniality, which emerges from the intersections of the borders of local histories that project global designs and local histories that enact them. And in this situated awareness of the borders, which the researchers experienced, emerged from the positionality of the researchers, drawn from two aspects. First is their idea of their position in the border of disciplinary terrain, where they often attempt to influence the global design, but their research is mainly regarded as particular knowledges, but also from their position in the borders of the global science structure, where many researchers felt that they have the desire to belong to the global domain, but face challenges of their relative distances from the global north. And in the process of navigating these borders, the researchers also resonated with this discrepancy between having to live in a colonial matrix and never really belonging to its memories. And in this study, basically illustrates the journey of these researchers and their attempts to delink from this global dialogue and bridge the distance between the universal and the particular, the known and the lower, the personal and the academic. In terms of values, when the values of these scholars, which was basically related to personally relevant, contextually relevant, or in their attempts to depict the experiences and realities of their lived experiences, were not reflected in the values of the global science. Some researchers exercised their agency and chose to delink themselves from the global dialogue. Thank you all for listening, and I understand that my entire research is quite vast, and so I therefore welcome questions in case you have any on any specific aspects of my research. Also, please feel free to go through my dissertation, which is available online via the QR code. Thank you, everyone. Over to Simon.
And thank you, Vedika. It's a pretty good study, isn't it? And I think the slides really helped us. We were struggling a bit with the connection. Actually, your sound dropped out several times, but there was so much in the slides that I think it was okay. I think people got a good sense of what your study has in it and what you're saying. But do any member of the webinar do ask questions of clarification if you miss something important in the presentation. Well, there's a lot of questions that arise, I think, and we've already got a couple of people. Well, Melissa Brunner has already come forward. I'll bring her in a moment, but let me ask you, Vedika, the strategic challenge, facing social science researchers who want to build agency and build their capacity in their own work in India and also contribute to the global conversation as well. I suppose from outside India. I mean, I suppose summation would be that if the researchers in social science in India can build a really strong conversation regionally and locally, then their agency is going to be enhanced, the quality of the work will improve, and then they'll be able to take more into the global environment. But just connecting to the global environment, it's in itself positions them in all the kind of ways that you point to. I mean, what do you think? I mean, as someone who's globally engaged, but also a social science researcher in India, what do you think the best strategy is?
Thanks, Simon, for the wonderful question. And I think it's really important that you brought up. And I think it's important to point out at this stage that also that within international relations, there was no specific associations for Indian scholars primarily, and so therefore there was an absence of the national environment as well, or national connections that would help them better engage with the global, as you said. But also talking about regionalism, I think the studies which have outlined as to how the topics of interest amongst Pakistani scholars are quite similar to the ones amongst Indian scholars, but due to the political challenges that exist, there is little same infrastructure support that could be meted out towards fostering greater collaborations between the two nations. But more so, I think a number of my participants felt quite or expressed quite positive ideas about, say, potential collaborations with China, for instance. They felt that understanding Chinese experiences could also provide them with an anchor to better, say, mold the conceptual tools together. For instance, like have a global Southern Alliance, for instance, was one of the ideas that was resonated by the participants. But again, as I said, that there are political challenges to greater regional integration that exists with India, and therefore the idea of regionalism is kind of a bit more minimal, while there are certain experiments which are actually been going on in trying to foster a greater Southern alliance.
Okay, thanks, Vedika. Let's bring in Melissa, who came in very early with a question about methodology and ethics. Melissa, yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Hi, Vedika, great presentation, and certainly as a American from Pennsylvania State University that's doing research in India, bringing forward their experiences and their voices is very important in the work that I do. And I have one question for you, because it's something that has been kind of a confusing thing from my end, and that is when you're doing human subjects research across nations, and India is part of it, how are you handling the human subjects research approval process? What type of system are you using? Did New Delhi or India require any specific type of IRB or human subjects research approval before you started your project?
I think my project is basically incorporating qualitative interviews with researchers, and these researchers were adults in the fields and ranged from, say, PhD scholars to professors. And I think this my research primarily involved like a 60 to 90-minute interviews. So it wasn't a human subject research in the traditional sense, or in the sense of psychology, for instance. But I think given my own familiarity with the field, I think I was primarily being able to draw on from those interviews and kind of try and outline the research landscape that they faced from their own perspective. And apart from that, there was a university ethics committee approval, which was needed by the University of Oxford, for instance. And that was a major ethical approval or ethical compliance scheme. Yes.
Thanks, Vedika. Thank you for your question too, Melissa. Can we bring in Elisa Brewis now? Elisa.
Thank you for the great presentation, Vedika. It really resonates with similar work I've been looking at in Indonesia. My question was about the teaching and learning environment. You just had a brief comment about the curriculum. So did they mention your participants things like student attitudes, student choice of research topics, the curriculum? Were they hopeful at all about the upcoming or future generation of IR scholars, like both in like locally in India and in general in the field of IR?
Yes, I think that's a very important point that you brought up, because I think teaching and learning also constitute a major part of these researchers' careers. And many of them actually found that many of them actually use really creative means of changing research, teaching techniques to be able to kind of deal with this coloniality of the syllabus itself or the discipline that existed. I think one of my participants said that she would often try a flipped methodology in which she would introduce students to the critical school of IR first and then the mainstream school, to kind of try and see whether the critical school can be seen as because the mainstream school often is perceived as the only perspective in some ways. And so therefore trying to see if there is a difference that happens if you kind of introduce people to the critical school first. So I think there were a lot of like creative approaches that the researchers were taking within the space of teaching and learning to kind of navigate this. But on the second aspect that you mentioned about the future generations, I think a number of researchers said that because of this idea of global competition, what happens is that a number of professors and students alike are perhaps much more inclined towards um, not asking certain questions which they believe that the answers would be more difficult to find out for. So I think one of the scholars mentioned about how with the greater global connections, there is a much more inclination to resort to a comfort space of between the professors and the students, just so that there is no challenges within in finishing the PhD program in time, for instance, and a number of issues around that as well. And this is not entirely a global phenomenon. I think it is also reflective of certain local challenges, like for instance, finances, which a number of students also face, and so feel that it's better to do a subject within the comfort space so that it gets completed within a period of time, etc. That being said, with a generation of researchers also trying to mold this coloniality, etc., I think the teaching learning process is definitely changing, and therefore they feel that with the change in this teaching learning process, the younger generation will perhaps be much more equipped to take up like different methodologies and perhaps use different conceptual tools, or perhaps just have the freedom to draw from non-Western knowledge sources. And I think that possibly is a positive hope that many scholars hold. Yes.
Thank you both. Can we bring in Sapna Kedia now? Sapna, are you there?
Yes, hi. Thank you. Hi, Vedika. Great presentation. I really appreciate the emphasis on colonization of research. And I also really like the point that you made about how researchers from Global South are not really considered when it comes to setting global agendas. I think that's really important to talk about. I was wondering if any of your research participants and scholars had any thoughts or any suggestions around how can we really start, in a way, decolonizing some of these processes, and how scholars from the Global South can be at the center of setting some of these research agendas. I was wondering if there were any suggestions.
I think the idea was probably resonated in this idea of agency and peripherality. I think a lot of the participants felt that this sort of adherence to a globally set agenda was also partly due to the structures that kind of supported it, that includes global university rankings, which primarily draws on research published in global citation indexes as one of the ways to kind of enhance the rankings of universities, and also was one of the various mechanisms for scholars to get promoted and to have like better career opportunities, for instance. So I think what scholars primarily do was to kind of say dealing from these ideas or from this idea of global visibility, again, which is one of the things that most scholars vie for. Also because the metrics in which, I think the idea is that the change in the metrics in which you judge a research, because scholars felt that currently the researchers were actually being judged on their publications in these top elite journals based in global north, but secondly also their access to funding, which also sometimes emerges from global north, but also thirdly in terms of collaborations, which is also easier to happen when you're working on these topics or these global agendas. So I think the scholars mainly voiced out about how there has to be a shift in the way we kind of like evaluate research, and try and see if that is true, firstly. But secondly, also, I think the idea that there needs to be greater infrastructure for scholars to be able to draw from non-Western knowledge sources. That's what we said, that they simply just resort to these sources just because they're readily available, as opposed to, say, drawing from, say, Confucianism or any other sources that exist from the non-Western world, just because it's very, it's for them, it's difficult to access, but secondly, just because of, say, the translations services that exist, that they're probably not even able to draw from knowledge sources that exist in Sanskrit, for instance. So I think if the change has to come both from the global, but also from the local infrastructures and agendas. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Vedika.
Thank you, Sapna, and thank you, Vedika. Catherine Montgomery is next, please. Catherine.
Hi, thanks, Simon, and Vedika, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And my question is a little bit leading on from what Sapna asked, and that is around the role of, wondered if anything emerged from your data around the role of the PhD in social science research, or, you know, how the PhD might construct, construct global connections between India and the UK, because obviously there's a very long history, colonial history there around the PhD. So I just wondered if anything had come up around that.
I think yes. I think there is, for instance, my interviews were specific to scholars who are doing their PhD within universities in India. And therefore, I think there was perhaps a need for greater institutional support for these PhD programs to be able to undertake research. As I said, that there was this tendency to sometimes resort to the comfort zone within PhD programs, and so giving little space for greater exploration for these researchers. I think there was the need that was pointed out was greater institutional support for these. But of course, because my research was focused on the Indian scenario, and I wanted to primarily interview researchers who are conducting research in the context of India, I did not kind of explore the scholars who perhaps continue to do their PhD abroad, or who are primarily undertaking their PhD abroad. But they were, say, participants who had returned from institutions abroad and kind of thought that there was greater institutional support which was provided, which kind of distinguished the programs within India from say, programs that exist elsewhere. But also, scholars also felt that sometimes due to the bureaucratic nature of certain institutions, like for instance, access to primary information, as one scholar pointed out, that access to archives on India was also much more easily accessible in the university overseas rather than in institutions within India as well. And so I think there was this idea of providing greater institutional support to these scholars.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great
Thanks,
presentation.
Catherine. Olga Mann is next. Hi. Where are you, Olga?
Oh, hello. Hi.
There
Can
you
you
are.
hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. I absolutely enjoyed Vedika's presentation. So my question is about the conceptual sort of tools that you use. Do you find Mignola's border thinking helpful? I found it very confusing because he also uses it often when he talks about decolonial multiculturalism. And generally, I'm just confused. So, and the second question is, do you use Indian theory or some local Pakistani theory, maybe, or philosophers in conceptualizing the theoretical framework for your research? So this is the two questions that I had. The reason why I'm asking is that sometimes I feel like we talk about our research participants and their struggles, but we ourselves, as researchers who research Global South in the Global North institutions, we ourselves also have these issues. How do we not perpetuate the epistemic injustices that we ourselves researching? So this was my question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olga, for the question. And you rightly pointed out about the ethics of doing research within the Global South. I think in my last seminar at CGHE, that was one of the key themes that I pointed out. So I think the way I navigate it is by trying to um, award greater voice to my participants in my research. That was one of the mechanisms. But in terms of Mignolo's uh, conceptual tools, I agree it is a bit confusing, but I think like decolonizing is never easy. And so I think that was one of the useful frameworks that I found. I initially began the research with trying to understand the phenomena from a center periphery perspective. But upon my interviews, I understand that the center periphery network was the structure framework was a bit too simplistic to be able to to be able to actively capture the complexity of this phenomena. And that is when I kind of came across Mignolo, and I felt that while it is confusing, I felt that it also accords researchers flexibility in being able to kind of, as I said, mold the theories to be able to actually use it for greater conceptualization. So I think that's why I used McDonald's. But apart from that, I think I use the framework of agency as well to understand, drawn from Amartya Sen's own work on agency, but also there is a specific section on which kind of is not drawn from any particular framework, which basically highlights as to the section on personal as academic, for instance, is a kind of a structure that I kind of make on my own and trying to understand as to how the participants often also draw on their own personal experiences of the lived realities to understand the realities better, and therefore thus provides them with an impetus to work around the Western conceptual tools and thus bridge the divide between the knower and the known. So these are the various ways in which I try to address the conceptual framing of my study. I hope that answers the question.
Any follow-up, Olga? If not,
no, thank you.
thanks, Olga. If not, I'll move to Jyoti Aurora Khanna's question. And Jyoti, I think, can't come onto camera. So I might repeat her question to you, Vedika, if I can. She's saying, did any of the respondents mention about how their research agendas were influenced or constrained by institutional and or state agendas in India, not just global agendas? And Jyoti is a researcher in India herself, and she's aware of the political space that she's working in. And if they did mention constraints set by the policy, government agenda, or institution, how are they navigating those problems?
Thank you so much for the wonderful question. And I think I did have an entire section of on the idea of the influence of the influence of politicization within research, which had to actually be scrapped out of my dissertation just because it was exceeding the word count. But yes, so to answer your question, I think they not really institutional agendas, but of course there was the state agendas with regard to research within international relations, for instance. But I think most scholars felt that think tanks were the ones that were more working towards fulfilling these these particular agendas. And so I think in the sense, I felt that scholars also were kind of peripheral within these national agenda schemes and structure and these nexus as well. And so that accorded them with greater flexibility, in sometimes also accorded them with greater flexibility, but also meant that they had much more limited opportunities. But I think the idea of the idea of research autonomy was also kind of I felt was a multi-layered concept. And so I think that while for instance in this space of academia, the idea of research autonomy wasn't that much of a problem. I think most researchers felt that they were able to take topics of their interest, but of course felt more constrained with the limited funding opportunities that occurred. And so one of the researchers pointed out that working on technology, if you work within, say, these think tanks, it's more likely that you would be asked to work on issues of national security, for instance, rather than issues that they were working on. And so therefore they kind of continued to not engage with that think tank space. And so therefore I think there was a disconnect between the national agenda space, the space of national agenda and research, and the space of academia in which the researchers operated in.
Thanks for that great answer, Vedika. Our next question is from David Mills. David, are you there, please?
Hi, Vedika. Really interesting presentation. My question really is to push you a little bit on what's happening, or what the geopolitical angle on all this is. Why? I know there's a new education plan in India that was introduced, and it's going to change some aspects of higher education in terms of creating institutes of eminence and a national research foundation. I guess my question really is, compared to China, does it surprise you that India hasn't been more worried about the strength of its regional research ecosystem and hasn't put in place more sort of funding or resources to build that? Because the comparison is interesting, isn't it?
Yes, thank you for the question. I do think that it's kind of surprising as to why there is not being greater institutional support. According to social science research in India compared to China, but also I think this is taking place in the context of neoliberalization of research spaces and university spaces in general, and I think NEP kind of plays it into that. As my research also says, and as participants also highlight, that there is that within the NEP, there's a greater push for universities to become much more self-sufficient in terms of funding, and therefore pushes you towards creating more endowment funds, for instance. And I think this kind of would, scholars felt, would probably exacerbate the gap between the privileged elite universities and the not so elite universities that exist within India and smaller social science research institutes as well. And so I think that would lead to much more constrained space in terms of funding. And I think it is in this context of neoliberalization that there is probably not much initiatives taken to promote social science research, which is perhaps not perceived to be of greater economic value for the policymakers. So that is definitely one aspect of it in which universities are pushed to kind of create their own funds and sort of reduce government spending. But also I think researchers pointed out about this emerging Ivy League syndrome within India, where there is, say, for instance, greater disparity amongst student groups that are, say, enrolling within elite institutions, and therefore this kind of exacerbates the capacities of central universities, perhaps, that were primary centers of research, and how there was this kind of line being created where students in would enroll into elite universities and would likely be much more pulled towards global universities within global north as well, and kind of creating this conveyor line. And therefore, they felt that students who did not fall into these certain categories would therefore be greater let out, which would also be much more problematic for social science research in India, which actually benefits from having the diversity of student population. But given that with the rising enrollment, scholars felt that if students from disadvantaged backgrounds were also joining universities, and scholars felt that if these students were given much more support, there's much more likely to have multiplicity within social science research in India, and therefore that would also benefit the field. So I think these are just a few insights. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thanks, David. Thanks, Vedika. Vedika, I've got a question for you now. Just thinking about India, you sort of think, well, there's India as a single nation, an idea, if you like, of the nation, but there's such regional and linguistic diversity. And there's so many important centres, so many major cities, which are often home to a distinctive cultural group, language group, and so on. And mostly what we've been talking about today has been this coupling of India and the global. But there's also the regional differences, and people are working regionally and locally. How much do they work nationally in social science as a kind of national conversation, and how much is it a regional or local conversation, do you think?
I think, again, in the field of international relations, the idea of the regional conversations or local conversations are a bit more limited because the field is quite small in and of itself. And so I think there is, say, just lesser number of scholars who are pursuing international relations research for them to be involved in different agendas. I think the kind of inclination towards global conversation is perhaps that's why much more dominant. But given that, I think the discipline is slowly moving towards other centers in India. So I think there is perhaps more conversations taking place in places like Chennai, for instance, at a distance from the national capital. So I think these centers are slowly emerging with the wider dissemination of the discipline itself. And probably with the rising university enrollments and greater enrollments in higher education spaces, perhaps these centers would also likely to be emerge, but would probably be more likely to emerge. Yeah.
Thanks, Vedika. I mean, I think many people who come to our webinars on a regular basis are becoming aware of how important India is and how interesting and complex the discussion about India is. We've had a succession of good presentations from scholars in India, although primarily from Delhi at this stage. We've tended to be rather regional about our take on India so far, but we hope that we'll continue to cover India and bring voices from India into the global conversation. Then your comment, or someone's comment in the interviews about the middle power status of India was interesting. I mean, I think that, geopolitically, India is now a strong middle power, not a China, not a US, but really tremendously important because of political economy as much as anything else, but also the longer distance from the colonial period, the more modernization proceeds, the more the country strengthens and so on. Leaving aside some of the political problems that are currently being experienced, there is a sort of upward curve, if you like. And I suspect that in terms of geopolitical influence, India and the UK are going to meet at some point fairly soon, with the UK going down while India goes up. So we might be having a seminar on middle powers, with the UK and India together in future in our webinar series. But let me ask you, because I think your work's really important, and you're a person who can work on all these different scales, nationally, locally, globally, and that's really great. That kind of multiple communication, multiple engagement really is the sort of thing which can make a lot of difference, because it can bridge a lot of the different communities and open up, spaces for new voices to come into, to the global or the national level. What are you going to do next? I mean, you've done this study of social science in India. Are you going to continue to research social science in India? Do you have another research agenda?
I think I probably thank you for the lovely question, Simon. But yes, I think my plan is to perhaps further study the social science research landscape, but also study it in relation to, say, China, for instance. And I personally believe that study that using China as an anchor to, say, understand experiences of India can be really useful, and can help unlock knowledge. Just because in the absence of this comparison, I'm aware that perhaps the default comparison is with the Western world or with UK, for instance. And so I think having a comparative study with China would definitely bring more diverse insights to it, but also give more avenues for greater collaborations. So that is my plan in terms of trying to see if there is greater scope for collaborations, but also, say, widening my topic interest to also other topics in the Indian higher education system.
Thanks, Vedika. And I think the China-India relationship and comparison is so important, isn't it? Because historically they were such strong countries, such shaping influences in Southeast Asia and Central Asia and West Asia as well. And that crossover between them in Southeast Asia, you can see the sort of, where the cultures meet almost historically. Really interesting how it plays out in places like Laos or Thailand, which sort of sit between the two cultural influences. And in the future, they're going to be as important again, and so different, in lots of ways. And so this relationship, becomes really important. I mean, Indian Chinese cultures arguably as different as the Western India or the Western China. And maybe India and the West are a bit closer than China is to the West. So India's got this sort of intermediate role as well at a geopolitical sense. But all power to you and all power to your work. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close and thank you very sincerely for your contribution to the webinars, and hopefully we'll have you back when your next project is reaching fruition. So good luck with your work, and folks, you can get in touch with Vedika. I'm sure if on email if you want to cooperate with her or learn more about her work. Thanks very much, Vedika.